Okay, so welcome everyone to another session of the Leuven seminar. And today we are welcoming Professor Peter Dues, who will present his book, his recently published book on Schelling. And before we start, I would like to ask you to turn on your cameras if you could, because this will give us the impression that we are all sharing the same digital room. And of course, if you have problems in your connection, it's perfectly fine. But otherwise, it would be nice to see you. And yes, so Peter Dues is emeritus professor at the University of Essex. And he has also taught at Middlesex University and at Anglia Ruskin University. He has been a Humboldt Fellow at the University of Tübingen and has held visiting positions at the University of Constance and at the Institute of Human Science in Vienna, and at the New School for Social Research at Columbia University, and in the Center for the Humanities in Grinnell College. He is author of numerous publications, such as the books The Idea of Evil, published in 2008 by John Wiley and Sons, and the book The Limits of Disenchantment, published in 1995 by Verso. And particularly relevant for our discussion today, he published also the paper Theory, Construction, and Existential Description in Schelling's Treatise on Freedom in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy, and of course, the book that he will present to us today, Schelling's Late Philosophy in Confrontation with Hegel, recently published by Oxford University Press. So we're really looking forward to your talk today. And just a word about the structure of the session. So it will be a little bit different today. Peter Dues will give us a 40-minute talk presenting the book. And following the presentation, we'll have an extended Q&A session in which you're all invited to ask him questions about the book. So thank you so much, Peter, for accepting our invitation. We are looking forward to learn more about your book and to discuss it with you. The floor is yours.
Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you for Karin for inviting me. This is the first opportunity I've had to elaborate on some themes of the book since I published it. So I'm very pleased about that, and especially as it's an opportunity to talk to specialists in the field. So I have a few PowerPoints. I tried to keep them down to a minimum because otherwise I think they become counterproductive and distracting. It's partly to help me as I go through. There are many themes treated in the book, and that is the reason for that is connected with the whole motivation for writing it in the first place, which is that there is a small body of literature in English already, touching on aspects of Schelling's critique of Hegel and his late work. These contributions usually take the form of essays, and it's often to really comprehend what's going on, because the concepts which Schelling is using, which are of course far less familiar than Hegelian concepts, are not placed within the whole frame of his late system. So that was one of my principal motivations for writing the book. Apart from the fact that I read Schelling's first lecture course in Berlin, the 1841 Philosophy of Revelation, when I was a PhD student and had very little idea what was happening. And it's been a kind of irritation ever since, I would say, the last 2 or 3 decades, really wanting to figure out what Schelling was saying there, because it seemed to me to be very, I had a feeling that there was an immensely powerful philosophical intellect at work, but very little understanding of what he was saying and what his relation to Hegel actually was. So what I tried to do in the book is lay out much more clearly than most English language publications, Schelling, the actual structure of Schelling's late system, how various concepts fit into it. And I think that helps us to make much more sense of the relation to Hegel in his late work. So that's really the explanation for why I wrote the book. I began in the middle by discussing rather abstract questions about logic and what Schelling calls reine Vernunftwissenschaft, pure rational science, and went through to the end. But then I realized that it was unfair to throw my readers right into the middle of Schelling's late system. So then I wrote 3 more chapters, starting from his work of the 1790s in the immediate Kantian aftermath and leading up to the late system. So that explains the structure of the book, which in fact more or less follows Schelling's whole intellectual itinerary, but for the last 2/3 concentrates on various ways in which his views differ from Hegel's views on various fundamental points. I've just selected 3 sort of foci for my discussion because otherwise it would become too diffuse. And I have a few preliminary remarks to make. So if Pavel could put up the first slide, I'll make a few points about that to begin with. Okay, so Heidegger has a very interesting lecture course on what is probably Schelling's most famous work, namely the Treatise on Freedom from 1809, commonly known as the Freiheitsschrift. It's probably the text by Schelling which most people have read, apart from the early Naturphilosophie, if they are not Schelling experts. So in the course of his discussion of Schelling, which I think is really very penetrating and interesting, Heidegger says something quite important, I think. So at one point he writes that the basic problematic of the Freiheitsschrift is the conflict between the concept of system as what he calls the geschlossene Begründungszusammenhang, a closed system of grounding, and the concept of freedom as what he calls a grundbedürftiger Anfang. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this kind of conflict as a kind of defining conflict of German idealism. On one hand, there is the demand for to create a system, a demand for systematic philosophy, but simultaneously there is a question about how freedom fits into this systematic project. I mean, we could spend the whole of the session talking about that, but I'm sure I don't need to go into too much detail. But what really interests me is what Heidegger then says about this basic conflict, which he says is the central to the Freiheitsschrift. He says the question concerning the system of freedom is not simply an object of philosophy. It is also not merely its authentic and encompassing object, but it is firstly and fundamentally and finally the condition of philosophy, the open contradiction in which it stands and which it brings about again and again. So what I'm interested in is this contrast between the question of system and freedom, or the system of freedom, being the Gegenstand of philosophy and it being the Zustand of philosophy. And this follows quite closely things that Schelling says in the opening pages of the book, where he says, for example, that I'm paraphrasing now, I didn't want to put everything on PowerPoints, but he says, Schelling says it's only the conflict between system and freedom, or between necessity and freedom, I should say. It's the conflict between necessity and freedom, which keeps philosophy alive. Philosophy and every higher activity or aspiration of the spirit keeps them alive. And I think this, I'd like you to take this as a kind of sort of basic point of reference for what I'm going to say, because there's clearly something very ambivalent about what Schelling is saying there, and also what Heidegger is saying there. Namely, on the one hand, that there is a contradiction, or there's an issue about the relationship between systematic necessity and freedom. But on the other hand, that conflict is itself the Zustand of philosophy. It's the condition of philosophy. And which seems to imply that if that conflict disappeared, then philosophy itself would disappear. So is this a conflict or a philosophical problem which needs to be resolved? Or is there a sense in which it is not desirable to resolve it because it's actually what energizes philosophy and keeps it in movement? And I think this is very important. And I think that this really gives us a clue to Schelling's subsequent philosophical itinerary, and also to the fact that his late system, as I'm sure many of you know, is marked. The defining characteristic of his late system is a distinction between what he calls negative philosophy and positive philosophy. I won't have the opportunity to go into a lot of detail about that, but from my point of view, the very fact that Schelling has this bipartite structure to his late system and draws a methodological distinction between negative and positive philosophy is itself part of the response to this fundamental problem that the conflict of freedom and necessity is the Zustand of philosophy. So there's a sense in which we have to acknowledge its irresolvability in a certain way through our systematic construction. That's the way in which, the basic way in which I read Schelling's late project. The other point that I wanted to make is that, as I'm sure many of you know, the concept of potentiality is central to Schelling's late work. The German word is Potenz. That used to be translated as potency. That's a bad translation, both for Schelling's early work and also for his late work, because in his early work he's using the word Potenz much more in the sense of an analogy to a mathematical power. It's to do with raising a certain standpoint to a higher reflexive level by analogy with a mathematical power. So potency doesn't really capture what Schelling is after there at all. In his late work, the concept undergoes a considerable shift, semantic shift, and it's much closer to the idea of possibility, potentiality in the sense of possibility. This is also fundamental for Schelling's thinking about freedom, because he understands possibility as what some philosophers refer to as a two-way power. In other words, possibility can be realized, but it can also not be realized. It can be actualized or not be actualized. And that openness in the notion of potentiality is again a central feature of Schelling's late thinking. So those were the basic 2 points de repère, 2 basic reference points that I wanted to throw out in advance of what I'm going to say in more detail. Okay, Pavel, I think we can move on to the next slide. So one important thing to bear in mind is that Schelling's late system is divided into a negative and a positive philosophy. I won't say very much about the positive philosophy, there's just not time. Then he calls the negative philosophy reine Vernunftwissenschaft. So this is a pure a priori science. It's a kind of transcendental activity of thought thinking itself, and thereby elaborating the fundamental structures of being. So there are lots of opportunities there for drawing significant contrasts and parallels between Schelling's negative philosophy and Hegel's logic. So in fact, in the central 3 chapters of the book, I'm largely concerned with different aspects of this issue. So in general terms, the relation between thought and being, the relation between thinking and being, and the way that this is conceptualized by Schelling and by Hegel. So one interesting point about this is that they both have in some respects, similar conception of how you start pure reine Vernunftwissenschaft, if we can use that as a term to cover both Hegel's logic and Schelling's negative philosophy. So this is a quote from a lecture course called Begründung der positiven Philosophie from Schelling's 2nd year in Berlin. He says this, there comes a certain moment when a human being has to make herself free not only of revelation, but of everything actual, in order to flee into an utter desert of all being, where nothing actual is to be found, but only the infinite potentiality of all being, the sole immediate content of thinking, in relation to which thinking moves only within itself, in its own ether. In this content, reason also has what is its totally a priori stance over against all that is given to it by being, so that starting from this content, it is able to know not just pure beingness in general, but the whole of being in all its stages. So you see there that notion of infinite potentiality. Schelling thinks that if you abstract radically from all the determinacy of the world or the determinacy of entities, then you reach what he calls die unendliche Potenz des Seins. He also calls it das Reinseiende, and sometimes he calls it das Subjekt des Seins, the subject of being. I translate this as beingness or pure beingness. It's a kind of neologism. It's not a complete neologism. Other philosophers have used that term in other contexts. And I won't try to explain now why I chose that translation, but by beingness, I mean this original starting point of Schelling's negative philosophy. So you can see that what's involved is a radical process of abstraction, and then you reach something he calls beingness, the infinite potentiality of being. This kind of procedure goes back to Descartes, I guess, this idea that we make a radical beginning by abstracting maximally, including, as Schelling here says, from revelation. So he's not dependent on any kind of religious source in order to carry out this process of pure thinking. So that's the starting point for the negative philosophy. Okay, I think we can have the next slide. So as Hegel says something similar, about the beginning of his Science of Logic. So in paragraph 78 of the Encyclopedia, Hegel compares the procedure which leads to the start of philosophical science with skepticism in the sense of doubting everything, as he puts it. However, he argues that such doubt is best conceptualized as what he calls the decision to will pure thinking, made by the freedom which abstracts from everything and grasps in its pure abstraction the simplicity of thought. So there seems to be a similar process of abstraction occurring in Hegel and in Schelling, in order to reach the points, the starting point of reine Vernunft, Wissenschaft. So now I want to think a little bit about the difference in the results. I think we could go to the next slide. So Hegel says at one point, this is in the Science of Logic, that the beginning is both immediate and mediated. Pure being, this absolute immediate, is just as absolutely mediated. However, just because it is here as the beginning, it is just as essential that it should be taken in the one-sidedness of being purely immediate. If it were not this pure indeterminacy, if it were determined, it would be taken as something mediated, would already be carried further than itself. A determinate something has the character of an other with respect to a first, thus it lies in the nature of the beginning itself that it should be being and nothing else. So what interests me about this is that Hegel concedes that this beginning is both mediated and immediate, but then he says, but we have to take it in the sense of the immediate, because that's what a beginning is. And I think it's possible to argue that there's something circular about this process of argumentation we find here in Hegel, because what if a beginning was dual or was double, rather than being needing to be taken as immediate? And I think we will find that Schelling has a dual concept of the beginning, and this duality, as I think may be becoming clear by now, is a recurrent feature of Schelling's thinking. Various dualisms keep pervading his thinking. I've talked earlier on about the dualism, the basic, absolutely defining dualism of negative and positive philosophy. And this is connected ultimately with the way he thinks about freedom. So it goes back to what I mentioned at the beginning and the quote that I picked up from Heidegger. Okay, next slide, please. So, so there's also the question of the transition at the end of the Science of Logic. I don't want to say too much about this, but as you'll know, at the end of the Science of Logic, Hegel then has to negotiate the transition into what he calls real philosophy, philosophy of nature, and then philosophy of spirit. And this is a crux in Hegel, and has long been debated in the Hegel scholarship, what actually happens at this point. To my mind, it doesn't make sense, as some commentators on Hegel claim, such as Stephen Holgate, for example, that there is a logical move that pushes the absolute idea beyond itself. All the logical moves have been completed by the time we reach the absolute idea. So Hegel says here in this quotation that the absolute idea is internally at rest. It's internally at rest. In other words, there's no further impulsion which is pushing it any further beyond itself in purely logical terms. And as you'll know, he uses this notion of a kind of Entschluss. There is some kind of decision of the absolute idea to release itself into nature. I'm not going to comment on the whole content of this quotation, but this is in fact one of the most celebrated, but to my mind, not the most important point at which Schelling wants to make a criticism of Hegel, namely that there seems to be a kind of interruption of the historical into the logical, or the notion of an Entschluss at this point, which refers to a different conception of freedom to the freedom of pure rational self-determination, which is the notion of freedom that we find developing throughout the logic itself. So Schelling, in one of his commentaries on this passage, says that this is like the eruption of something historical, or geschichtliche philosophy. So in his first lecture course, in which he outlined the distinction between negative and positive philosophy, which was his Munich lecture course of 1827-28, he calls them logical and historical philosophy. So logical is what later becomes negative philosophy. What he calls geschichtliche philosophy later on becomes positive philosophy. But the point Schelling makes is that there's a kind of eruption of the geschichtliche into Hegel's thinking at this point. Again, this is something that we can take up in the discussion if necessary. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So what I want to do now is try to explain as simply as I can what happens at the beginning of Schelling's negative philosophy. So this is where he begins to elaborate his theory of what he calls potentialities. So he has a system of abbreviations of signs that he uses for the potentialities, as you can see on this slide. So A0 is what he calls the subject of being, or das Sein des Selbst, or what I'm translating as pure beingness. So I'll try briefly to explain how this dialectic gets going. Once the dialectic gets going, then it keeps sort of recursively operating upon itself, and it generates a system of basic forms of being, which is what Schelling is concerned to elaborate in his negative philosophy. So the first thing that we need to understand is why A0 becomes A1, which then becomes what Schelling symbolizes as B, or his shorthand for that is B. So A1 to B is the first move in the dialectic of the negative philosophy. So the point here is that if you begin with the idea of pure potentiality, it would not make sense even to refer to it as potentiality unless it realized itself or actualized itself. But since we're at the very beginning here, the only thing that potentiality can actualize is itself. There's nothing else to actualize. So potentiality actualizes itself as what Schelling calls B, which is the objectivity of potentiality. So this has some similarities with what Aristotle calls proteihule, materia prima, the sort of basic, the material or objective basis of everything which exists. So this is, we can say that B is precipitated just by virtue of thinking A0. This is a process in pure thinking. B is precipitated as the objective ground of all entities, as it were. So the problem, the dialectical contradiction which arises at this point is that if potentiality completely actualizes itself, and as I said a moment ago, there's nothing else to actualize, then it's no longer potentiality. It's fully actualized. It's stopped being potentiality. So therefore, a contradiction arises, and potentiality has to remain suspended in its being as potentiality at a second level. So this is what Schelling calls A2, and it's the basis of what he calls form, to use the Aristotelian word, or we can say of the concept. So the concept is pure being as a potentiality. It's a potentiality of being. But it's a formal potentiality. That's the difference from A1. So he now has a conflict between A1 and A2, because both of these manifestations of potentiality are striving for the status of potentiality. And this generates a third principle called A3, which is the conciliation of matter and form, which eventually will give rise to organic structure, which is a much more successful conciliation of matter and form than pure immaterial being, and eventually to what Schelling calls spirit. So the important point about this is that none of these, or not even all three taken together, is the subject of being, das Sein, der Selbst, or A0. So this is clearly an important difference from Hegel. Once the dialectic gets going in Hegel, there is nothing, as it were, being held in reserve. There is nothing in the background which has not been fully plunged into the dialectic, because the dialectic begins, as you know, in Hegel's logic with a simple oscillation between being and nothing. Here there is something in reserve, as it were, which is A0. So that's an important difference. Okay, we can move to the next slide. So here I've tried to illustrate this this process. So at the top there you have A0, and then this gives rise to A1 becoming B, A1 becoming B, which is the material principle, if you like, then gives rise to A2, which is the conceptual principle, and the conflict between B and A2 then generates this third principle that he calls A3. So A3 he calls das Sein sollende, that which ought to be. B he terms das Sein könnende, in other words, the objective potentiality of beings or entities. And A2 is das Sein müssende. It's what has to be because it's formally or conceptually determined. So he's generated three modalities at the same time as he's generated three potentialities of being. So why is A3 das Sein sollende? Well, the way I like to think about this is that normative force can be redescribed as the necessarily possible or the possibly necessary. I think intuitively that's quite a powerful way of describing what normative force is. It's the necessarily possible or the possibly necessary. So Schelling says, this is in the philosophy of revelation, this third cannot be pure being able to be, das Sein könnende, and also not pure being. For these sites are already taken. It can only be what is potentiality in being and being in potentiality. That in which the contradiction between potentiality and being is posited in its identity. So I've tried to illustrate that at the bottom of this slide. Once this process, this a priori process of elaboration is completed, we have what he calls the organism of objectively posited reason. And the final category or concept of Schelling's negative philosophy is what he calls the idea. So he has the same term as Hegel for the culminating concept of his negative philosophy. But you can see in that diagram I've put at the bottom of the slide there that A0 has still not been itself absorbed into the dialectic of the potentialities. So I should say that the idea in Schelling, as in Hegel, sort of recuperates its own itinerary. The idea is essentially the completion of negative philosophy, which means that it's the retrospective recuperation of the itinerary which leads up to itself. Okay, next slide, please. So, one point I don't have on a slide here, but it will emerge hopefully again towards the end, is what occurs at the end of negative philosophy for Schelling. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we know very well that at the end of the science of logic, we have this question of the transition to nature, the Entschluss, the idea freely releasing itself, and so forth. In Schelling, we have something different. We have an encounter with what he calls unprethinkable being. He has many other terms for it. Sometimes he calls it the pure that, das reine das, das unvordenkliche Sein. He's taking apart the semantic components of the German word unvordenklich, which normally means something like immemorial, to mean unprethinkable. So there's an encounter with unprethinkable being at the end of the elaboration of the negative philosophy. Again, this is something we can talk about at the during the discussion period. The reason the negative philosophy is important for Schelling, or one of the reasons, is that you have to go through that process of exhausting the a priori structure of being before you have this moment of encounter. That's why he calls it negative philosophy, because it, as it were, absorbs everything that can be known a priori. So if after we've carried out that process and reached the idea, there is still something which we have not taken account of, have not comprehended, this is what he refers to as unprethinkable being. I'll come back to that later on at the end of my talk. So what I wanted to say a little bit about now is the question of the practical standpoint in Hegel. In fact, I've got two more principal things I want to talk about. One is the problem of the practical standpoint, and one is what I mean by Schelling's affirmative genealogy. So it seems to me that there is no irreducible practical standpoint in Hegel's philosophy. So when I said that there's a question about freedom and the relation between system and freedom, which is organizing Schelling's thinking, another way of expressing that problem would be to say, what happens to the practical standpoint within philosophy, which is constructed as a system? So in the Zusatz, so the sort of the additional material added to paragraph 234 of the Encyclopedia Logic, Hegel says the following: we must not then come to a stop with this finitude of the striving will, of course, and it is through the process of willing itself that this finitude is suspended together with the contradiction that it contains. The reconciliation consists in the fact that the will returns in its result to the presupposition of knowing, and thus consists in the unity of the theoretical and the practical idea. The will knows the purpose as what is its own, and intelligence grasps the world as the concept in its actuality. This is the true standpoint of rational knowing, and unsatisfied striving vanishes when we recognize that the final purpose of the world is just as much accomplished as it is eternally accomplishing itself. A little later, he says, the carrying out of the infinite purpose consists simply in suspending the illusion that it has not yet been carried out. So just a bit later, again, I haven't put this on the slide because I didn't want to clutter up my talk with too many slides. But then Schelling introduces the concept of what he calls Täuschung, which means illusion or deception. So he says that from the finite practical standpoint, there is this Täuschung, that there is something we still need to do, something we still need to strive for in order to bring about the good. But from the purely philosophical standpoint or speculative standpoint, we can see that the final purpose of the world is just as much accomplished as it is eternally accomplishing itself. And we have to suspend the illusion that it has not yet been carried out. So he also says in that Zusatz that human beings live in that illusion. They live in that illusion. And it's an illusion generated by the process of the idea. But it seems to me that there's a shift in subject between the we, as we finite human beings, and the idea itself. Seems to me it does not make sense to apply the notion of Täuschung to the idea. So I detect a certain strain or tension, just to put it mildly, between the question of the practical standpoint and the speculative or absolute philosophical standpoint in Hegel. And this connects with two things. Firstly, what I said about das Sein Sollende. So for Schelling, that which ought to be is that which should be is the third of his potentialities. And he says at one point, das Sein Sollende ist auch schon ein Sein. So that which ought to be is also a form of being. It's an actual form of being. It's not simply an illusion in which we live, as Hegel puts it in this passage from the Encyclopedia. Incidentally, after I sort of homed in on this passage as being quite significant, I discovered that John McTaggart, in his studies of the Hegelian dialectic, but also in his commentary on Hegel's logic, also homes in on this particular passage. And he's worried about the way that Hegel uses the concept of illusion at this particular point. So we can say, just very broadly, very roughly, that this question of the relation between the practical and the speculative or theoretical standpoint is also reflected in the division between positive and negative philosophy. This is there's something indigestible about that conflict, as I said right at the beginning. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So another way we can put this problem is in terms of the conflict between determinacy and indeterminacy. Again, this could have a lot of elaboration, which I don't really have time to do here, but Hegel says in the Elements of the Philosophy of Right, paragraph 7, freedom thus consists neither in indeterminacy nor, sorry, that's a mistake in the PowerPoint. It should say, obviously, indeterminacy or determinacy. No, I shouldn't have repeated indeterminacy once, repeated it once. Freedom thus consists either in indeterminacy, neither in indeterminacy nor indeterminacy, rather it is both. Okay, so I think there's an interesting question there about, is it possible to think the sort of dialectical unity of determinacy and indeterminacy? How could we possibly think that? And again, I think this is a way of orienting ourselves towards the fundamental problem that I was talking about at the beginning, the problem of the relation between the Grund- und bedürftige Anfang, as Heidegger calls it, which is the indeterminacy, and the geschlossene Begründungszusammenhang. Yeah. So Hegel clearly is aware of that there is a serious tension here which needs to be addressed. And in a more concrete form, he also talks about it in the introduction to the lectures on the philosophy of history. So at one point in the introduction to the lectures, he says the will of the individual is free if he can determine his volitions absolutely, abstractly, in and for himself. How then is it possible for the universal or the rational to determine anything whatsoever in history? So Hegel's aware of this issue, that if we say, yes, the will genuinely is free, then how can there be a rational, universal, or logical structure to the evolving historical process? Because this seems to imply that there's some overriding rational structure which shapes how, which is expressed through the will of individuals. That's what the best way to put it. It's expressed through the will of individuals. But is that compatible with the notion of the will being free? That's the question he raises, and he actually says at this point in the introduction to the lectures that it's a paradox. He doesn't say it's a contradiction. I mean, normally Hegel talks about things being contradictions, which then applies that there's some kind of dialectical resolution which is available. But in this particular point, he says it's a paradox. It's not simply a contradiction. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So this is the last issue that I want to talk about. As you all have realized at this point, the whole the basis of Schelling's distinction between negative and positive philosophy is that in positive philosophy, which is what re-emerges after this transition point of the confrontation with unprethinkable being, does not operate in terms of rational necessity. So Schelling has a whole hermeneutics of the evolution of human consciousness, right from as far back as we could possibly imagine, up until his own time. In fact, the French philosopher Vladimir Yankelevich was really the first person to grasp that Schelling, like Hegel, also has a history of what we could call a history of consciousness, or a history of human consciousness. In his book, L'Odyssée de la conscience dans la dernière philosophie de Schelling. So that was a really path-breaking work in terms of understanding Schelling's way of interpreting the history of human consciousness. Again, you know, I could spend all afternoon talking about that, but unfortunately I don't have time. But the point is that the positive philosophy, which is what this history of consciousness consists in, does not operate in terms of the kind of dialectical reason that we see functioning in Hegel's understanding of the historical process. So I want to keep to my time. So the last of the three main points that I wanted to talk about was what I call Schelling's affirmative genealogy. So the notion of affirmative genealogy I took from the social theorist and philosopher Hans Joas. Other philosophers may have used it, or other thinkers may have used it. I'm sure they probably have. but Joas uses it in his book Die Sachlichkeit der Person to talk about the theologian and philosopher and historian Ernst Troeltsch, contemporary of Max Weber. And the idea is that an affirmative genealogy is interested in investigating the origins of forms of consciousness. So it has a certain analogy with the kind of activity that was carried out by modern thinkers such as Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, those thinkers that Paul Ricoeur gathered together and called the Masters of Suspicion, probably familiar with that expression. So, but the point about an affirmative genealogy is that although it operates in certain ways like an ethic of suspicion in trying to uncover the concealed determinations of forms of consciousness and ways of thinking and experiencing, ultimately it is not reductive. It does not reduce those forms of consciousness to their determinants. Because if you do that, another kind of paradox arises, namely you carry out your genealogy, I would ostensibly in order to enhance human freedom by disclosing these concealed determinants. I mean, certainly you could say that in the case of Marx, also Freud. But if there is a strict form of determination operating there, you've cancelled the very freedom which you're seeking to disclose and recuperate because of the presuppositions of genealogy or ideology critique as a method. So I'm using affirmative genealogy as a shorthand for an approach which tries to avoid that problem of genealogical or ideology critical analysis. So one question I'm interested in, I'm sure many of you will have views about this, is whether Hegel falls into this category. Is Hegel a kind of affirmative genealogist? I mean, he certainly seems to be interested in one sense in forms of false consciousness. As we know from the phenomenology of spirit, all the way through the phenomenology of spirit, forms of consciousness are mistaken about their actual structure and their actual internal dynamic. And this gives rise to a successive form of consciousness and so forth in an evolving process. So my question, however, is Hegel only concerned with false consciousness in the sense that we may not be aware that we are already with ourselves in the other, which of course is his definition of freedom. Denn die Freiheit ist eben dies, in seinem anderen bei sich selbst zu sein. That's Hegel's definition of freedom. And I think we can see that definition of freedom flows directly from this primordial Hegelian operation, which Dieter Henrich identified as Hegel's Grundoperation, namely self-negating negation. So if we have self-negating negation, as in my little diagram there, we have the positive as a result, but the positive is only positive as a result, and therefore it's not genuinely positive, and therefore it negates itself in turn, and we have this cyclical process. I think we can find this process in all kinds of, in more or less every dimension of Hegel's thinking, and you can see it's also implicit in the way he defines freedom as finding yourself in the other. But the question is there anything fundamentally holding back or repressing, constraining or distorting a form of consciousness as we would expect in genealogy or ideology critique, or is this simply a dialectical stage in an unfolding development of consciousness? And I think that this may not be entirely apparent to you what I'm after at this point, but I think there's a significant distinction between Schelling and Hegel on this particular point. So we're nearly at the end. There's just a couple more slides. We can move to the next slide. Yeah, so again, this is a whole new dimension of Schelling that I can't really elaborate in much detail. Schelling has a theory of what he calls mythological consciousness, which is a stage in the development of human consciousness. But the point about what he calls mythological consciousness is it's compulsive and blind in a manner which is much more analogous to psychoanalytic ways of describing constrained or compelled forms of consciousness than it is to what we find in Hegel, in my view. So I'll just read out the quote in the middle of that page. He says, precisely because those mythological representations were not free, but blind products of consciousness, they became immediately practical. Consciousness was driven to deeds and actions by them and was forced to express itself through deeds and actions, just as it is a general psychological observation that human beings express in deeds and action representations which arise involuntarily in them and which they cannot get mental control of, cannot mentally objectify. That's a quotation from Schelling's philosophy of mythology. So what this means is, as I say at the bottom here, human beings are far from being at home in their mythological experience of the world. So this is broadly up until the first millennium BC. Schelling thinks that there's a major turn in global history at this point, which more recent thinkers like Karl Jaspers have theorized as the axial turn. So Schelling already has the idea of an axial turn in the history of human consciousness. Prior to that point, we have this methodological form of consciousness, which is alienated, compulsive, or ecstatic, is a term which Schelling himself frequently uses to describe these forms of consciousness. They're literally outside themselves. They're ecstatic. Okay, next slide, please. So we just looked at Hegel's definition of freedom, or a summary where he says that freedom is being at home with yourself in the other. So I tried to find the most abbreviated, the most compressed version of Schelling's definition of freedom. So at one point in the first Berlin lecture course, so this is the one where sort of Engels, Kierkegaard, Bakunin, various other dignitaries were in the audience. He says this about freedom. Whatever in being is potentiality and does not cease to be potentiality, and conversely, whatever is potentiality that can pass over into being without losing any of its power over being, thus whatever can be and also not be, that is the completely free. So in German, was im Sein Potenz ist und nicht aufhört Potenz zu sein, und umgekehrt, was Potenz ist, die ins Sein übergehen kann, ohne von ihrer Macht über das Sein zu verlieren. Was also sein und nicht sein kann, das ist das vollkommen Freie. So I think you can see here that there's a significant distinction between Hegel's way of defining freedom as being with yourself in the other and Schelling's way of defining freedom. From my point of view, this idea of potentiality being in being in potentiality is a quite close analogy for Hegel's idea of subjectivity finding itself in the other. Potentiality is very closely tied to subjectivity. For Schelling, as we saw in that expression, he uses das Subjekt des Seins. So we have this idea of realizing yourself in the other, potentiality in being. Sounds like a paradox, but then Hegel's definition is also a kind of paradox. We have potentiality in being in potentiality, but then we have this additional clause, which we don't find in Hegel. Was also sein und nicht sein kann. So there has to be the possibility of not finding yourself as well as finding yourself in order for freedom to be fully realized. And that goes back to what I was saying right at the beginning about this sort of primordial status of potentiality in Schelling's thinking, which cannot be dialectically exhausted. There's something about it which cannot be dialectically exhausted. And he's always interested in that limit, but it's a limit that you only reach after you've carried out a dialectical process. I mean, that would be one way of summarizing his way of approaching these questions. Okay, I think I'll leave it there because I think I've said quite a lot already. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Peter, for this dense and very stimulating talk. And the floor is now open for questions. And so please use the raise hand function in Zoom. And if it's not working, you can also post your questions in a chat, and I can read it. And I can perhaps start with first question. I'm sure you mentioned it at some point, and perhaps I missed it. Is a clarification question, because you said at the beginning that you think that this passage from the end of the logic to the beginning of the philosophy of nature, which is the famous criticism that Schelling has against Hegel, is not his most important one, or it's not the one you think is the most essential criticism that he has. And I was wondering, why do you think that, and what is the most essential criticism that he has? Is it something related to his conception of freedom, or yeah?
Well, I think all the issues are interconnected, but I think it's a mistake to assume that Schelling spends a lot of time criticizing Hegel in his late work. In fact, he doesn't. I mean, there is one chapter in his lectures on the history of modern philosophy which people home in on. But as I said right at the beginning, really that chapter from Schelling's lectures on the history of modern philosophy is not intelligible on its own, because you simply can't understand the vocabulary that he's using, what kind of criticism he's trying to articulate. Yeah, I think that as I've said, I think most of the way through this afternoon, it's to do with the understanding of freedom, or to put this in another way, in what sense is a logical process a free process? So I think Hegel, I mean, some of you may disagree with me, Hegel thinks that a logical process is a free process as long as it's radically self-determining. It doesn't matter that it unfolds with necessity. In fact, Hegel says at various points that philosophy is only interested in the necessary. Philosophy is not interested in the contingent or the arbitrary or the purely subjective. Philosophy is interested in the necessary. And Hegel talks about the freedom of the idea and so forth. So really, that would be one way of homing in on the distinction. So the only reason that crux at the end of the logic is significant is because Schelling thinks it's a kind of neuralgic point, where some different idea of freedom emerges. And many people have asked the question, how can the absolute idea make an Entschluss, take a decision, and so on and so forth? But it's actually more interesting than that, because at various points towards the end of the logic, Hegel says the absolute idea is noch logisch, it's still logical. And then he says there's a trieb, there's a drive for it to go beyond itself. So there's a sense that the logical is in fact in some way limited, in some way hard to define. It is limited, it's noch logisch. I think this is often not fully appreciated by commentators on Hegel. But to my mind, I think it's just a distraction to home in on that particular issue. Because for Schelling, the important issue is whether logical necessity, even if radically self-determined, is really equivalent to freedom. And he has another expression. He has various expressions to try to articulate this kind of further dimension of being that he thinks that that Hegel is not fully taking account of. Sometimes he calls it das nicht sein könnende, that which is not unable to be, that which is not, das nicht sein könnende, yeah, that which is not unable to be. It's like a double negative, but it's a double negative which is meant to articulate this sense of a kind of irresistible process. He finds that irresistible process articulated in Hegel's logic. Now, he has a place for that kind of process in his thinking. That's what he calls negative philosophy. But he thinks that, as I was explaining during my talk, that negative philosophy hits a kind of limit where it realizes there's something which it is still not fully confronted or taken account of.
Okay, great. Thank you. Pavel.
All right, thanks very much for that talk, Peter. So I'm still trying to digest this Schellingian definition of freedom from the last slide. So this, well, I guess one thing that comes to mind, this extra clause of not be, that which can be, but also not be, kind of reminds me of the move from the Freiheitsschrift, whereas, you know, it's the ability to do evil, to do good or evil, and he emphasizes that or. So I guess there's a long story of how he developed from the one to the other. But is there an analogy there? And is there? I mean, why did he kind of update it in this manner? I guess that's the long story. But if there's a kind of a short version, because I think in general I'm finding it difficult to sort of grasp what he means by freedom there in this last slide.
Yeah, I mean, it is connected with. I think the Freiheitsschrift, as I indicated in my talk, is sort of the beginning of his reflection on this problem, and it emerges as this kind of contradictory imperative. Well, there's a conflict between freedom and necessity, but then, as he says, if we didn't have this conflict, then philosophy itself would die. And then Heidegger says it's the Zustand der Philosophie. It's not something that philosophy has as an object, which it can try and resolve. It's just the Zustand of philosophy, to be dwelling in this this contradiction. So, I mean, I think that the idea of the choice in the freedom essay is significant in that regard. The problem with the freedom essay is that he's still, despite what he says in the introduction, he's still trying to solve the problem in something like a conventional philosophical sense. So he says right at the beginning, we have these two different approaches to freedom. We have the kind of the intuitive experience of our own spontaneity as agents. But then we also have a kind of conceptual, systematic approach to freedom. How do we fit freedom into our overall philosophical conception of the world? And these two ways of approaching freedom, we could call them phenomenological and conceptual or systematic, seem to be in a conflict with each other. But I think in the Freiheitsschrift, he still hasn't realized that there is no way of simply fusing those two different perspectives. But it takes him a long time to reach that realization. And I think eventually this distinction between the conceptual and the phenomenological, or we could call it the theoretical and the practical, there are various ways in which we could articulate it. It debouches in the distinction between negative and positive philosophy. So eventually he realizes the only way to deal with this problem, if that's the right way of putting it, is that we can't even have a single unified system, as this was understood earlier in German idealism. We actually have to have a bipartite system in order to approach this basic issue. Yeah. Does that make it clearer?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Leonard.
Thanks. Hi, Peter. Thanks for that talk. That was very interesting. I found it very good that you started off with pointing out a similarity between Hegel and Schelling, in particular the idea that both embrace a version of the idea of pure thinking. And I also fully agree that there's sort of a very important difference between both, or an illuminating difference, is that Schelling has this idea of holding something in reserve, as you put it, and that this has to do with this ultimately actualizing idea signified by A index 0. But then I was wondering, so if you look at that distinction from a Hegelian perspective, you would probably want to know, so why on earth should that be a great move to make? Because wouldn't that end up in all sorts of Kantian problems of applying rational principles to a presupposed reality, potentially ending us up with the eternal issue of a sort of unknowable substratum of thought? And I can see Schelling develops all that out of a discussion of Kant's transcendental ideal, and I can see why from a Kantian point one would want to say, well, that's a bullet you have to bite. There is something that isn't graspable in thought alone, and if you claim otherwise, you're working with reine Gedankendinge, and that's not great. But then again, that doesn't seem to be a sort of Schelling, the post-Kantian, who also wants to overcome that sort of thinking. So I was wondering, how would you defend Schelling's decision to hold something in reserve against the Hegelian objection that ultimately ends us up with some sort of like unthinkable substratum for thought determinations?
Yeah. Yeah, that's obviously that's an absolutely crucial question. As you rightly said, Schelling himself at one point in Begründung der positiven Philosophie, he refers to Kant's conception of the ideal of pure reason in order to argue for this moment of transcendence. I think I would say he doesn't think, although he calls it unprethinkable being, it's only unprethinkable for an instant, as it were. Because as soon as you make the transition into positive philosophy, you are then trying to decipher the consequences of this concept. Yeah? So it's not unprethinkable in the sense of it's a Ding an sich or something of that kind. I think my full answer to that question, and it's something that I say at one point in the book, I think I said it in my introductory remarks as well, that you have to look at the overall system and the overall systematic implications. So that would, the way that Hegel's history of consciousness unfolds, the way that Schelling's history of consciousness unfolds. So I'm sure you know this because you work on Schelling, but Hegel has this notion of self-negating negativity, which is his Grundoperation, if you follow Dieter Henrich. I think I say at the end of the book that Schelling has something you could call his Grundoperation, which is the overcoming of unthinkable being, or let's put it another way: the transmutation of an unthinkable being into potentiality, into pure potentiality. So there are a number of important points about that. One is that he thinks that what he calls blind being or unthinkable being has, as it were, in one sense, a priori been overcome, because that's what potentiality is. But also that das Blindseinde, this kind of premodal pure concept of being, also has an effectivity. And we can see that in the history of human consciousness, because human consciousness keeps falling back into these compulsive ways of thinking and these compulsive ways of experiencing. So that's what he also describes as das nicht sein könnende. Yeah? So I think you have to take, as it were, the system as a package, and you have to say, well, Schelling thinks just experientially, historically, phenomenologically, if we look at human history, we see these constant relapses of freedom into a kind of form of blind compulsion. And the best way to understand that is there's a sort of dimension of being which has, in principle, been overcome, but can keep resurging. But we don't find that in Hegel. But there is no point in denying it. It's a kind of a posteriori argument. I mean, once you've made the move from negative philosophy to positive philosophy, you're really offering a kind of hermeneutics of the history of human consciousness. And therefore, you have to make the proposal that seems to make the most sense. So I think the procedure is fundamentally abductive. It's no longer a purely speculative logical procedure. It's an abductive procedure. He's trying to give you the story about the kind of, the fundamental mechanics of being, if I can put it like that, which make the most sense of the history of human consciousness. I think that's the way I would try to justify it.
Great. Next question by Henning.
Thank you, Peter, for the great talk. And my apologies that you cannot see me. I have no camera here in my office.
Okay.
I'm most intrigued in the relation between negative and positive philosophy. So you already said a few things about that, but still seems to be a topic that is very puzzling, not only for many Schelling scholars, but in a way also for Schelling himself, because he criticizes Hegel's transition from logic to philosophy of nature, as you have analyzed in your talk. But there seems to be a similar transition, and so the question is from negative philosophy to positive philosophy. And so the question is, once we are in positive philosophy, why do we need negative philosophy in the first place? So it seems to be more than, say, a conceptual framework that we then use in positive philosophy. In some passages, Schelling seems to suggest that negative philosophy comes up with a series of hypotheses, perhaps, that are then tested in positive philosophy. And as Thomas Buchheim recently pointed out in his late works, he even withdraws that and says it's not even about hypothesis, but something much weaker than that. So I wonder what you would make of that.
So I think that the basic the basic motivation for the negative philosophy is that we have to go through this. We have to go through this rational process. In other words, we have to establish how much what we can know about being a priori, yeah? In order to establish what the limit of that kind of approach might be. So I think that's the fundamental rationale. I mean, it's also true that it's in the negative philosophy that he originally elaborates his theory of the potentialities and the dialectic of potentialities, which I laid out, towards the beginning of my talk. But as regards the relation between the negative and the positive, he's talking about, well, I like to call them vectors of being. He's not talking about Denkbestimmungen, as Hegel calls them, or categories, so much as he's talking about sort of fundamental sort of orientations or directions of being which stand in conflict with each other. We could maybe even call them drives, Triebe, different drives of being towards the particular, towards the universal, and towards the reconciliation of those two dimensions. So that means that once you move into positive philosophy, you're talking about tendencies or directions. I mean, there's nothing wrong with saying we can discern a kind of certain direction in the historical process, or we can discern a certain tendency in the development of human consciousness. But we can say that without saying that this is in any sense rationally determined or logically necessary. So I think that's the way in which I would try to articulate the distinction between the two conceptions of philosophy. So there are various things that he says which are, as you indicated yourself, quite puzzling, but very interesting. So he says that in positive philosophy, reason frees itself from itself. Die Vernunft, die sich von sich selbst befreit. Yeah. So, in what sense has reason liberated itself from itself in positive philosophy? I think the basic intention of that sentence is that positive philosophy is now confronting, to put it in shorthand, the fact of the world and its process and its evolution. Reason is no longer spelling out its own immanent movement. Reason has opened itself to something. It's opened itself to the fact of the world. And therefore, it is operating much more freely, because it's operating fundamentally hypothetically. It's trying to frame the most compelling, the most coherent, and most systematic conjecture about where we are historically, how we came to be here, how our conception of freedom has evolved, and so forth. And he says that quite explicitly. Yeah. So at one point in the philosophy der Offenbarung, he says that reason is in existence because of spirit. It's not that spirit is in existence because of reason. Yeah.
Okay, good. Rob Dunphy.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much for the talk, and I'm really looking forward to working through the book. I wrote down a couple of things, and I think I can say them both quickly, and then if you only want to respond to one of them, that's fine. So the thing there was one thing I didn't understand, and there was one thing that I just wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about. The thing I wasn't sure I understood was that earlier on in the talk, you were talking about Schelling's use of the word potens and how its meaning sort of shifted. And you said in his later work, which is then what you talked about, that it was something like possibility, right? So then when you were talking about those opening moves in the negative philosophy, and I think it was specifically when you're talking about the move A1 to B, that you said, and I wrote it down, it would not make sense to refer to it, it being das Sein Könnende, I think, it would not make sense to refer to it as potentiality unless it actualized itself. And I think a lot of people are going to say, I don't understand that. But, right? If it's potential, then it could actualize itself and it could not. So, I didn't understand that. And then the invitation to say a little bit more about something was, you took a passage from Hegel's logic. It was from With What Must the Beginning of Science Be Made? And it was when he was saying, okay, yes, sure, the beginning is both mediated and immediate, but because it's the beginning, we have to take it just as immediate. He said there could be something circular there. It sounded like the circularity was probably, the beginning must be immediate. Why? Well, because beginnings have to be immediate or something. And so it's begging the question. And you said, I think there's an alternative here. And it sounded like that was going to relate to something Schelling had to say, but I sort of lost the connection. And I wondered where you were going with that. So if you have the time, I'd like to hear more about that as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Rob, because those are both important points. It's true that I was too abbreviated in addressing them. So the question about potentiality, I thought about that for quite a long time, because clearly when we normally talk about a potentiality, it can or cannot be realized. I mean, in ordinary cases. So, my ice cube has the potentiality to melt if I drop it into warm water. Or to take an organic example, the acorn has the potentiality to grow into an oak tree, but it might fall on barren ground, and that might not happen. So, the difference is, at the beginning of pure rational science, there is nothing but potentiality. Die unendliche Potenz des Seins. So there's no specific entity which has potentials. There is just potentiality. Okay. Well, what makes that potentiality? If nothing ever happened, if nothing was ever actualized, it wouldn't. Why would we even call it potentiality? So he called it would be nothing, or an expression that he uses at one point is nicht nichts, sondern als nichts. It would be as nothing. So this connects with another aspect which I didn't really elaborate, which is that Schelling's very interested in the distinction between contrary and contradictory and negation. And he uses various ways of talking about that. He talks about the difference between le néant and le rien in French, but also about Aristotle's distinction between me on and uk on. So potentiality it's non-being, it's not non-being, it's not das Nichts, as what Hegel's concept of being oscillates into. But the important point for your question is that it wouldn't even be potentiality, it would just be le néant, unless it realized itself. But there's nothing to realize except itself. All it can do at that point is reflexively actualize itself. Because there's nothing else exists in our thought experiment. So the problem, and it has to do that because it wouldn't even be potentiality unless it precipitated itself. But that then generates a contradiction because if it's fully precipitated itself, and it has to, then there is no potentiality. It is no longer potentiality. So it both is and is not potentiality, yeah, simultaneously. So that's the basic contradiction which gets Schelling's dialectic going. And I think that that also highlights the difference from Hegel, because Schelling's beginning is double in the sense that it's this process of precipitating itself as what he calls be, which we could say is being in its sort of blind material compulsive form, and simultaneously it's held in reserve as potentiality. So it has that double form. So Schelling thinks that what typically happens in modern philosophy is that this process of A becoming B has, as it were, always already happened. And that's what philosophers latch onto. They latch onto B. So Spinoza calls it Substanz, for example. And then he elaborates everything from that. Spinoza is the classic example he takes. But what's forgotten is that process of precipitation in the first place. And I think he would say something similar about Hegel, that when Hegel starts with being, he's forgotten that process of precipitation, which gives you something like being as an object of thought in the first place. So that's why I think. So another way of putting that is that Schelling is not trying to deny the process of abstraction, whereas I'm sure you're aware there's a debate about the status of the process of abstraction in Hegel, because is Hegel saying, in line with that quotation I gave, well, we have to forget that it's mediated. In order to get going, we have to forget that we've abstracted. We have to forget that it's mediated. But how do you do that? I mean, Kierkegaard famously then sort of comes in and says, but that means you have to abstract from the abstraction. But that just leads you into an infinite regress. Whereas Schelling is saying it's double. We know we've abstracted. So we're not eluded. We don't have to deceive ourselves about that. That's point one, that we know we've abstracted. Point two, of course, is that being in its absolute form, if you want to call it that, appears at 2 points in Schelling's late system. It appears at the start of the negative philosophy, but then it reappears in the interval, as it were, between negative and positive philosophy in this other form, as what he calls das unvordenkliche Sein. And there it really is unprethinkable. Whereas at the beginning of negative philosophy, he actually says it's the concept in the sense of the unity of the concept and being. So again, it's quite Hegelian. You start with the unity of the concept and being, but that's just a kind of transition. So it's an instant that you have to go through. As soon as you've thought it, it's precipitated as be. And that's why it's so easy for philosophers to then get literally sort of entranced by be, as it were. That's his basic idea.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Christian Keslik. I'm not sure if you're speaking now, Christian, but we cannot hear you. We cannot hear you if you are speaking. Do you want to write your question in the chat? Yeah, it's.
Louise, can I ask a question instead?
Yeah, go ahead, Kari.
Yeah, so I wasn't going to, yes, but since we have this moment where we need to know for sure whether Christian is going to say something. So I don't think my question is a very short one, but I'll try to keep it very short. Yes. So I don't think personally that Hegel was interested in being. Yeah, I think that the logic, for instance, is interested in the concept of being, and that it deals with all kinds of concepts and abstracts from the very beginning from whatever else there is apart from concepts, insofar as they're being thought by human beings and used to achieve knowledge of something. And so I was wondering, listening to you, whether in the end Hegel isn't more modest than Schelling. Yes, because Hegel would say, look, what I can do as a philosopher is to think about concepts and to derive them in a systematic manner, etc. And everything else I cannot really touch. And I don't want to, yes, because this would be overstepping the boundaries of what can be done within philosophy. So maybe it's kind of paradoxical, but isn't in the end Hegel the more modest philosopher?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, because there is, of course, there's now a substantial body of Hegel interpretation which takes that kind of approach, to say that Hegel is really interested in the the sort of self-evolution of concepts, the way in which, or categories, the way that one generates another, and this gives us our fundamental framework or unavoidable framework for everything that we can think about as a topic, trying to understand the world or thematize it. So there are two interesting things to say about that. One is certainly on that reading, Hegel is more, how can I put it, more metaphysically abstemious or ontologically abstemious than Schelling, because Schelling at the beginning says that die unendliche Potenz des Seins ist die unendliche Potenz des Erkennens. So Schelling makes the claim that in his negative philosophy, he's actually thinking the fundamental forms of being. So you're absolutely right to say, according to this, how can I put it, more reticent or deflationary, maybe it's another word, interpretation of Hegel, then Hegel is much more wary even than Schelling of making ontological claims as opposed to making conceptual claims, which is a kind of interesting reversal, because the kind of classic understanding of Schelling was that he was saying that Hegel's assuming that he can think about being in this in a strongly a priori fashion, even more so than I can, and this seems to reverse the situation. I mean, that's not my understanding of Hegel for two reasons. I mean, one is that at the end of the logic, he really does think he's got the unity of thought and being. That's what the absolute idea is. So the absolute idea has actually articulated the fundamental structure of being. Now, but it's done so in a particular sense, because as we were discussing earlier on, there's still the transition to the real philosophy, which has to occur in order to complete his system. But I think, to my mind, it's quite clear that Hegel thinks that when you make that transition, you're going to find the same dialectical structures in a more concrete, in a more concrete form. So there's a sense in which the logic has laid down the dialectical structures you're going to find when you start doing real philosophy. So this idea that Hegel's not interested in being, I find very hard to square with what he says at numerous points in his work. I mean, to put it in the most simple terms, that would leave a kind of dichotomy between absolute thinking or a priori thinking and the ontological domain, which I think would be basically anathema for a German idealist. So it's very interesting. So one of the origins of this tradition, the category theory interpretation of Hegel's logic in particular, is Klaus Hartmann, who wrote that classic essay on Hegel's logic. What's interesting about that Hegel, a non-metaphysical view, that's what it's called. What's interesting about that article by Hartmann is that he doesn't deny that there's an ontological realm. He doesn't say Hegel's given us all the categories and that's all that there is and all that we need and so on and so forth. Hartmann at various points in that essay says, yeah, there's the ontological realm, but then he says basically says, don't scratch where it doesn't itch. I mean, don't start asking unanswerable questions about being and ontology, which philosophy isn't in a position to answer. And that seems to me to be quite peculiar and much more neo-Kantian, which is, of course, was the origins of Hartmann's own thinking. He was a neo-Kantian philosopher, rather than anything authentically German idealist. I mean, that would be my response to that issue.
Okay, great. So, Christian, do you want to give it another try, or it doesn't seem to work? Yeah, I'm sorry about this. But you can write to me, or you can post your question in the chat, and I can read it for Peter. Mead McLaughlin.
Hello, thank you. Yes, a simple question, I think. I'm still puzzled by Schelling's definition of freedom as you provided it on the final slide, and in particular the contrast you want to draw with Hegel. So you quote Schelling as saying that the completely free is whatever can be and also not be. And I'm just struggling to see why that isn't just Schelling's translation into his own language of the Hegelian claim you'd already cited earlier from the philosophy of right, that freedom is the unity of determinacy and indeterminacy. So for Hegel, actualized concrete freedom is determinacy affirmed and embraced on the basis of indeterminacy, particularity and universality. And that seemed to be the same as what you had Schelling saying in terms of his phrasing, in terms of whatever can be and also not be. So I just couldn't really see what the difference there was with Hegel.
I see. So, but isn't Hegel saying it is that process of determination and finding yourself concretely in the world, which is the genuine experience of freedom? Isn't that what Hegel is saying? Hegel doesn't say freedom is, finding yourself in the rational state, but also not finding yourself in the rational state, or anything along those lines. So, to my mind, that's where the distinction between the two definitions of freedom lies. So, as far as Hegel is concerned, as long as the state expresses your rational identity, then everything, there is no problem. Well, you might say, how could anyone object to that? But then I think further issues arise, and we could identify them, for example, by asking, is the philosophy of right supposed to be descriptive or normative? Is he saying, what a rational state should look like? Well, that wouldn't really fit with his Zonnenkritik and his avoidance of making, what he would regard as arbitrary recommendations about how the world should be. And that fits in with what I showed on some of the slides, in which he says the absolute good is always already realized in the world. And he says it doesn't need to wait for us. The absolute good doesn't need to wait for us. No? On the other hand, sometimes he qualifies what he's saying. Sometimes he seems to be bite the bullet and say, look, your freedom is just within whatever social order you happen to find yourself. And that, if it exists at all, that it's going to be sufficiently rational that you should find yourself in it. That's the way I read him. Whereas Schelling is not saying that. He's not saying that there is some kind of speculative guarantee that the situation, the socio-political situation you find yourself in, is going to be sufficiently rational. So that's why we need that additional clause, as it were, about whatever can be and also not be. Does that help to make sense of it?
Yes, I understand where you're coming from. I suppose the difference is that reading Hegel in accordance with what he's saying about freedom involving the unity of determinacy and indeterminacy would then mean taking perhaps more seriously than you seem to want to do, or to recognize as being achieved in Hegel's own thinking on this matter, what he says in section 5 of the Philosophy of Right about the moment of indeterminacy being essential to freedom. So it seemed to be the way you are construing Hegel's actual realized account of freedom, that moment gets somewhat put to one side in favor of freedom involving this affirmation of determinacy and particularity, which may indeed be correct when it comes to the what Hegel in fact goes on to say in the Philosophy of Right about freedom, as you were suggesting. But in line with what he says in section 5, that would seem to put Hegel more in line with what you have Schelling as saying. That was all.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I can see there is that. Of course, he does acknowledge that moment of indeterminacy, but that moment of indeterminacy has to negate itself in line with his general conception, self-relating negation. So if there is, he often connects freedom with the idea, or he says that freedom is the idea actualized, and so on and so forth. So if that process of moving from indeterminacy, let's put it like this, is the process of moving from indeterminacy to determinacy itself determined? Because if it is, there isn't a genuine moment of indeterminacy. And I think that would be a way of putting your finger on the difference, that Schelling is saying the movement from indeterminacy to determinacy has to have itself, that movement itself has to have an indeterminacy to it, whereas Hegel seems to be saying it's determined. So, I mean, another sort of abbreviated way of putting the issue, which I think it helps to highlight fundamental conflict between Schelling and Hegel. If you think that ultimately you can sublate the distinction between the theoretical and practical viewpoints, to my mind, that means the triumph of the theoretical viewpoint. And that's a problem for Schelling, I think, that the practical viewpoint gets entirely absorbed into the theoretical viewpoint.
Great. So I think we can wrap up the official part of the discussion. So please join me in thanking our speaker today for this great talk and great discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I also would like to remind you that next week we have another session of the Leuven seminar, and we'll have a book launch for Yelsha Schmidt's book on the methods of metaphilosophy, Kant, Maimon, and Schelling on how to philosophize about philosophy. We have here the program of the entire term. You are all very welcome to join again at the same time, same day of the week. And yeah, so thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.